My son demanded my car. I unleashed the paperwork bomb. Insurance gone, bank ties severed, then the 14-day ultimatum that flipped his world.
The phone buzzed against the marble countertop of my kitchen island, jolting me from my morning coffee ritual. Marcus, my 24-year-old son who'd been living in my guest house for the past 3 years. Rent-free, utility-free, responsibility-free. I should have known this wasn't going to be a pleasant conversation when I saw his name flash across the screen at 7:30 in the morning. Marcus rarely surfaced before noon unless he needed something, and judging by the urgency of his call, he needed something big. "Dad, we need to talk." His voice carried that familiar edge of entitlement mixed with barely concealed impatience that I'd grown to recognize over the years. "I'm coming over right now." "Good morning to you too, son." I kept my tone neutral, though something cold was already settling in my chest. "What's so urgent that it can't wait until a reasonable hour?" "Just be ready. This is important." The line went dead before I could respond. I stared at my phone for a moment, then set it down beside my untouched breakfast. Outside the kitchen window, I could see the guest house where Marcus lived, smoke already rising from his chimney despite the mild October weather. Everything about that arrangement had been temporary when we'd agreed to it. Temporary had somehow stretched into 3 years of me funding his lifestyle while he pursued his passion projects and startup ideas that never quite materialized into actual income. I walked to my home office and pulled out the manila folder I'd been avoiding for months. Bank statements, credit card bills, automated transfers that had been bleeding my accounts dry while Marcus lived like a trust fund baby. The numbers told a story I'd been too generous to acknowledge. $63,000 over 3 years, not counting the car insurance, health insurance, cell phone bills, and every other expense I'd absorbed because family takes care of family. That's what I told myself every month when I'd approve another transfer to cover his costs. The sound of footsteps on my front porch interrupted my financial archaeology. Heavy, determined footsteps that announced Marcus had arrived with an agenda. I closed the folder and walked to the front door, already knowing this conversation would change something fundamental between us. Marcus stood on my doorstep, wearing his usual uniform of expensive jeans and a designer hoodie, both purchased with money he'd never earned. His dark hair was perfectly styled despite the early hour, and his expression carried the kind of confidence that comes from never having to worry about consequences. "We need to discuss your car situation," he announced, brushing past me into the living room without waiting for an invitation. "My car situation?" I followed him, watching as he settled into my leather recliner like he owned the place. "Marcus, what are you talking about?" "Look, Dad, I've been thinking about this for weeks." He leaned forward, his hands clasped together in what I recognized as his serious business pose. "The Honda Civic you're driving is embarrassing. I mean, it's a 15-year-old economy car. You're a successful financial planner with clients who expect a certain image. How does it look when you pull up to their offices in a beat-up Honda?" I glanced through the window at my reliable Civic parked in the driveway. Beat up was hardly accurate. The car had been meticulously maintained, serviced regularly, and had never given me a day of trouble in all the years I'd owned it. More importantly, it was paid for reliable transportation that served my needs perfectly. "Marcus, that car has been completely dependable. I don't see any problem with it." "That's exactly the problem. You don't see it." His voice took on the condescending tone he used when explaining things to people he considered less sophisticated. "Dad, perception matters in your business. Clients want to feel confident that their financial planner is successful enough to manage their money effectively. Rolling up in a Honda Civic from 2009 doesn't exactly scream financial success." I studied my son's face, seeing something I'd been willfully blind to for years. This wasn't concern for my professional image. This was something else entirely, something that made my chest tighten with recognition I didn't want to acknowledge. "And what exactly are you proposing, Marcus?" "Simple solution. You take my Maserati. It's the perfect car for someone in your position. Luxury, sophistication, the kind of vehicle that commands respect. Your clients will be impressed. And honestly, it'll probably help you land bigger accounts." The Maserati. I'd watched Marcus buy that car 18 months ago with money I'd lent him for what he'd called a crucial business opportunity. $47,000 that was supposed to launch his consulting firm. Instead, it had purchased a sleek black sports car that spent most of its time parked in my driveway while Marcus Ubered to bars and restaurants he couldn't afford. "And what would you drive?" He gestured toward the window where my Honda sat in the morning sunlight. "Obviously, I'd take the Honda. It's not ideal, but I'm willing to make that sacrifice for your success." Think of it as a temporary arrangement while you build up your client base with a more appropriate vehicle. The audacity was breathtaking. My son wanted to trade his luxury sports car, purchased with my money, for my reliable economy car, which he considered beneath his standards. The same son who hadn't paid for his own housing, utilities, food, or transportation in 3 years was now concerned about my professional image. Marcus, let me understand this correctly. You want me to drive the Maserati that I essentially paid for, while you drive my Honda, which you just described as embarrassing? Dad, you're missing the point. This isn't about who paid for what. This is about maximizing opportunities. You're in a position to benefit from driving a luxury vehicle. I'm willing to step down temporarily so you can step up professionally. Step down temporarily. The phrase hung in the air between us like smoke from a fire I hadn't noticed starting. Everything about this conversation was wrong, from the timing to the premise to the casual way Marcus was rearranging our lives to suit his convenience. I walked to the kitchen and poured myself another cup of coffee, buying time to process what was really happening here. Through the window, I could see Mrs. Patterson from next door walking her ancient golden retriever, the same morning routine she'd maintained for the 8 years I'd lived in this house. Normal people living normal lives, not orchestrating elaborate schemes to upgrade their transportation at someone else's expense. When I returned to the living room, Marcus was scrolling through his phone, probably checking social media or texting friends about his brilliant manipulation of his naive father. The sight of his casual dismissal of my reaction triggered something I'd been suppressing for months. Son, I said quietly, setting my coffee cup down with deliberate precision, I need you to explain something to me. Marcus looked up from his phone with mild annoyance. What now? Help me understand how someone who hasn't paid rent in 3 years, whose car payment I've been covering, whose insurance, phone bill, and groceries I've been funding, gets to dictate what vehicle I should drive to maintain my professional image. The color drained from Marcus's face, but he recovered quickly. Dad, that's completely unfair. I never asked you to support me. You offered, and I've been grateful for everything you've done. This car swap isn't about taking advantage of your generosity. It's about helping you succeed. You never asked me to support you? I kept my voice level, though heat was building in my chest. Marcus, 3 months ago you called me crying because your account was overdrawn, and you couldn't make your car payment. 6 months before that, it was an emergency dental bill you couldn't afford. Last Christmas, you needed money for gifts because your consulting business was slow. Each time you asked, and each time I provided. Those were temporary situations, different circumstances, temporary situations that have been occurring monthly for 3 years. I walked to my desk and retrieved the manila folder, setting it on the coffee table between us. Do you want to see the bank statements, the credit card bills, the automatic transfers that have been keeping you afloat while you lecture me about professional image? Marcus stared at the folder like it contained evidence of a crime he'd thought he'd gotten away with, which, in a sense, it did. Dad, I don't know why you're making this so complicated. I'm trying to help you. Help me? I opened the folder and pulled out the top bank statement, the one showing a transfer of $850 to Marcus's account just 2 weeks ago. Help me understand how someone who needed $850 for rent money last month is now qualified to advise me on career strategy and vehicle selection. The silence stretched between us like a bridge neither of us wanted to cross. Outside, a garbage truck rumbled down the street, the sound of normal Tuesday morning life continuing, while my relationship with my son shifted into something I didn't recognize. Look, Marcus finally said, his voice losing some of its earlier confidence. Maybe I haven't been as financially independent as I should be, but that doesn't change the fact that you'd benefit from driving a better car. Your image matters in your business, my image. I leaned back in my chair, studying this young man I'd raised and supported and loved despite growing evidence that my generosity had created something I didn't like. Marcus, in my 26 years as a financial planner, I've never lost a client because of the car I drove. You know what I've lost clients over? Advisors who live beyond their means, who make poor financial decisions, who prioritize appearance over substance. That's different, is it? And because from where I'm sitting, it looks like you're asking me to help you maintain a lifestyle you can't afford while criticizing mine for being too modest. Marcus stood up abruptly, pacing to the window where he could see both vehicles in question. The morning light caught the sleek lines of his Maserati, a beautiful machine that represented everything wrong with our relationship. Expensive, impressive, and completely unsustainable without my continued financial support. Dad, you're overthinking this. It's just a car swap. Temporary, like you said. Once my business takes off, we can switch back. Once your business takes off, I'd heard variations of that phrase dozens of times over the past 3 years. The consulting firm that needed just one more month to land its first major client, the app development project that required additional funding for marketing, the cryptocurrency investment opportunity that was definitely going to pay off this time. Marcus, I said quietly, tell me about your business. The current status, I mean. Clients, revenue, projected income for the next quarter. He stopped pacing and turned away from the window. Why are you interrogating me about my business? This is about helping you project success to your clients. Because I'm trying to understand how someone whose business generates no measurable income is qualified to give me advice about professional success. I kept my tone conversational, but every word was carefully chosen. Help me see the logic in that. The question hung in the air like a challenge neither of us had expected. 3 years of careful avoidance, polite fiction, and willful blindness had led us to this moment where pretending wasn't possible anymore. Marcus sank back into the recliner, his earlier confidence completely evaporated. His hands fidgeted with his phone, then with the zipper of his expensive hoodie, anywhere but making eye contact with me. It's been slow, he admitted finally. The consulting market is really competitive right now. But I've got several prospects in the pipeline, and I'm confident that things will turn around soon. Several prospects in the pipeline. The same prospects he'd been discussing for 18 months. I'd heard about these mysterious potential clients so often they'd become like family friends I'd never met. Marcus, I need you to be completely honest with me. When was the last time you had actual paid work? Not prospects, not potential opportunities. Actual income from your consulting business. The silence that followed told me everything I needed to know. My son, who'd been living on my dime for 3 years while criticizing my choice of transportation, hadn't generated a single dollar of legitimate business income in longer than either of us wanted to acknowledge. That's what I thought, I said softly. And now you want to trade cars because my Honda damages your image while you drive it to job interviews you're not getting. Dad, that's not fair. What's not fair, Marcus, is 3 years of me funding your lifestyle while you develop opinions about how I should live mine. I stood up and walked to the window, looking out at both vehicles. My reliable Honda that had never let me down, and his flashy Maserati that represented every poor decision I'd enabled over the past 3 years. The morning sun reflected off both windshields, but only one of those cars belonged to someone who'd actually earned it. So here's what's going to happen, I said, turning back to face my son. You're going to keep your Maserati, and I'm going to keep my Honda. But more importantly, you're going to start paying your own car payment, insurance, and every other expense related to that vehicle. Marcus's face went white. Dad, you can't just cut me off like that. I need time to get established. You've had 3 years to get established. How much more time do you need? But the real surprise was just beginning. Because what Marcus didn't know was that I'd been planning something for weeks. Something that would teach him exactly what it meant to earn the things you wanted instead of demanding them from people who'd already given too much. The car situation was about to become very different indeed. But first, I had a phone call to make. I walked to my office and closed the door, leaving Marcus sitting in stunned silence in the living room. My hands were steadier than they'd been in months as I scrolled through my contacts and found the number I needed. David Chen, my insurance agent for the past 15 years. A man who understood complicated family dynamics because he'd navigated plenty of his own. David answered on the second ring. Robert, good to hear from you. What can I do for you today? I need to make some changes to my auto insurance policy. Specifically, I need to remove a vehicle and add a driver restriction. Through the closed door, I could hear Marcus pacing in the living room, his expensive sneakers squeaking against the hardwood floor I'd refinished myself 2 summers ago. The same floor he'd tracked mud across countless times without offering to help clean it. Which vehicle are we removing? David's voice carried the professional neutrality of someone who'd handled stranger requests. The 2022 Maserati Ghibli, policy number ending in 4847. I want it completely removed from my coverage, effective immediately. A pause. That's the vehicle registered to your son Marcus, correct? The one you've been covering under your family policy? That's correct. As of today, Marcus will need to secure his own insurance coverage for that vehicle. I'm no longer responsible for it. I could hear David typing in the background, updating records that would fundamentally change Marcus's situation within the hour. Without insurance coverage, that beautiful Maserati would become an expensive paperweight sitting in my driveway. Done. The vehicle has been removed from your policy. Is there anything else I can help you with today? Actually, yes. I need to add a driver restriction to my Honda Civic. Only I am authorized to operate that vehicle. Anyone else driving it would void the coverage completely. More typing. That's an unusual request, Robert. May I ask why? Let's just say I'm clarifying ownership boundaries for my family. Sometimes people need concrete reminders about what belongs to whom. After ending the call with David, I contacted my bank and credit union, systematically removing Marcus from every account where he'd been granted access over the years. The joint checking account I'd opened to make it easier to transfer money for his expenses. The credit card where he'd been an authorized user for emergencies that somehow occurred twice monthly. The automatic transfers that had been bleeding my retirement savings dry, while I told myself I was helping my son establish himself. Each account closure felt like removing a leech that had been slowly draining my financial health. By the time I finished the last call, Marcus would discover that his easy access to my resources had evaporated as completely as his imaginary consulting business. I opened my laptop and began researching something I'd been considering for weeks but hadn't had the courage to implement: moving companies. Specifically, companies that specialized in helping people relocate quickly and efficiently. The guest house had always been a temporary arrangement, and temporary was about to become permanent. The knock on my office door interrupted my research. Come in. Marcus entered looking like a man who'd been doing calculations in his head and didn't like the results. Dad, I think there's been a misunderstanding. I didn't mean to sound demanding about the car situation. Maybe we can work out a different arrangement. I closed my laptop and looked at my son standing in the doorway of my office, his earlier confidence replaced by something that might have been genuine concern. For a moment, I saw echoes of the little boy who used to help me rake leaves in the fall, who'd sit on my shoulders during parades, who'd cried when his goldfish died and made me promise we'd have a proper funeral in the backyard. But that little boy had grown into a man who thought it was acceptable to demand his father's possessions while contributing nothing to the household that supported him. Marcus, there's no misunderstanding. You made your position very clear this morning. You think my car is embarrassing, and you believe you're entitled to make decisions about what I should drive to protect my professional image. I kept my voice calm, but every word was chosen with the precision of a surgeon making an incision. The time for gentle suggestions and hopeful thinking was over. What I don't think you understand is that your concern for my professional image is somewhat ironic, given that you haven't generated any professional income to be concerned about. Dad, that's not entirely fair. I've been working on several projects, and the market has been challenging. The market has been challenging. I'd heard that excuse so many times it had become like background music in our conversations. Always external factors, never personal accountability. Tell me about these projects, Marcus. Specifically, what have you been working on this week? He shifted uncomfortably, his hands finding their way into his pockets. Well, I've been developing a business plan for the consulting firm, researching potential clients, updating my LinkedIn profile, developing a business plan. For 3 years, Marcus had been developing business plans, researching opportunities, and updating professional profiles. The result of all this development and research was exactly $0 in revenue and a lifestyle funded entirely by my generosity. And how much income have these activities generated in the past month? Marcus looked away, focusing on the diplomas hanging on my office wall, certificates representing 26 years of actual work, real clients, measurable results, everything his theoretical business lacked. Income isn't the only measure of progress, Dad. Sometimes you have to invest time in building relationships and establishing credibility before the financial returns materialize. Invest time, another phrase that had become meaningless through overuse. Marcus had been investing time for 3 years while I invested money, and only one of us was seeing any return on that investment. Son, I said, walking around my desk to face him directly, I need you to understand something that's apparently not been clear enough in our previous conversations. I opened my desk drawer and pulled out the folder of bank statements, the same folder that had been haunting me for months with its documentation of my financial martyrdom. This is what your time investment has cost me over the past 3 years: $63,000 in direct support. That doesn't include utilities, insurance, groceries, or the opportunity cost of the money I could have been investing for my own retirement. Marcus stared at the folder like it contained photographs of a crime scene, which in many ways, it did. I've been subsidizing your lifestyle while you've been developing business plans and researching opportunities. Meanwhile, you've decided that my choice of transportation is embarrassing and needs to be corrected through a car swap that benefits only you. Dad, I never meant it like that. I was genuinely trying to help. Help me understand then. How does someone who's never successfully run a business become qualified to advise someone who's been self employed for over 2 decades? The question hung between us like a bridge that neither of us wanted to cross. 3 years of polite fiction had led us to this moment where the truth couldn't be avoided any longer. Marcus sank into the chair across from my desk, his earlier bravado completely deflated. When he spoke, his voice was barely above a whisper. I know how this looks, Dad. I know I haven't been as successful as I hoped when I moved into the guest house, but I genuinely believe that having you drive a nicer car would help your business. And I genuinely believe that having me stop funding your lifestyle might help your business development efforts become more urgent and focused. I pulled out my phone and showed him the call log from my morning activities. Insurance company, bank, credit union, each call representing another severed connection between his financial needs and my resources. As of this morning, you're responsible for your own car insurance, your own credit card payments, and your own banking. The automatic transfers that have been keeping you afloat are canceled, effective immediately. Marcus's face went through several emotions in rapid succession: shock, disbelief, anger, and finally something that might have been panic, as the reality of his situation became clear. Dad, you can't just cut me off like that. I need time to transition, to get my business established. I have expenses, commitments. You've had 3 years to transition. How much more time do you need to generate your first dollar of revenue? The silence that followed was deafening. Outside, I could hear Mrs. Patterson calling for her dog. The normal sounds of a Tuesday morning in a neighborhood where people took responsibility for their own lives. But this is just the beginning, I said quietly, because the car situation is about to become much more interesting than a simple swap. I picked up my phone and dialed a number I'd memorized years ago, but never thought I'd actually use. The number for Precision Auto Transport, a company that specialized in relocating vehicles quickly and efficiently. Marcus watched with growing alarm as I arranged for his Maserati to be picked up that afternoon and transported to a secure storage facility across town. A facility where it would remain until he could prove he had the insurance, registration, and financial means to maintain it independently. What are you doing? His voice cracked slightly, the first genuine emotion he'd shown all morning. I'm teaching you the difference between ownership and entitlement, son. You seem to think that because I paid for that car, you're entitled to keep it indefinitely while making demands about mine. But it's my car. I drive it every day. Is it? I pulled up the registration documents on my computer, documents that told a very different story about ownership and financial responsibility. According to these legal papers, the car is registered to me, insured by me, and purchased with my money. You've been driving it, but driving something and owning something are very different concepts. Marcus stared at the computer screen, seeing his assumptions crumble in real time. The beautiful sports car he'd been treating as his personal property was, legally and financially, mine to do with as I pleased. And what pleases me right now is to store it safely until you can demonstrate that you're capable of maintaining it without my continued financial support. The transportation company would arrive in 3 hours. By evening, Marcus would discover exactly what it felt like to have your lifestyle change without warning, without consultation, and without regard for your convenience. But the real lesson was just beginning, because I'd been planning something much more comprehensive than a simple car repossession, something that would address 3 years of entitlement and financial dependence in ways Marcus couldn't imagine. I reached for my phone again, ready to make the call that would change everything. The call to Morrison Property Management, the company that handled rental agreements for people who needed to find new living arrangements quickly. The guest house arrangement was about to become as temporary as it was always supposed to be. The phone rang twice before a crisp professional voice answered. Morrison Property Management, this is Janet speaking. I need to discuss terminating a month-to-month rental agreement on my property, the guest house at 1247 Oak Ridge Drive. Marcus's eyes widened as he began to understand the scope of what was happening. This wasn't just about car insurance or bank accounts. This was about everything. Of course, Mr. Thompson. Let me pull up your file. I see you have a tenant in the guest house currently. Is this a standard 30-day notice situation? Actually, I'd like to explore options for earlier termination. The tenant has been, shall we say, non-compliant with certain aspects of our informal arrangement. I watched Marcus's face cycle through emotions as he processed that his living situation was as precarious as his transportation. Everything he'd taken for granted was suddenly negotiable. We can certainly work with you on that. Given that it's a family member, as noted in our files, there might be some flexibility in the timeline if both parties agree to the terms. I appreciate that. I'll be in touch within 24 hours with a definitive timeline. After ending the call, I turned back to Marcus, who looked like a man watching his entire world restructure itself without his input or consent. Dad, this is insane. You can't just upend my entire life because I suggested you drive a nicer car. Suggested? I kept my tone measured, though something cold and final was settling in my chest. Marcus, you didn't suggest anything. You demanded. You walked into my house this morning and announced what was going to happen with my property based on your assessment of my professional needs. The distinction mattered more than he realized. Suggestions came from equals. Demands came from people who believed they had authority over your decisions. Marcus had revealed exactly which category he thought he belonged in. I need some air, I said, standing up and walking toward the door. We'll continue this conversation later. But I wasn't going outside for air. I was going to make one more call, the most important one of the day. The call to my attorney, Patricia Hendricks, who specialized in family law and had helped me navigate the legal complexities of supporting adult children without creating permanent financial obligations. Patricia answered on the first ring, her voice carrying the crisp efficiency of someone who'd handled similar situations countless times. Robert, good morning. What can I do for you? I need to discuss legal protections regarding family financial support and property use. Specifically, how to ensure that generosity doesn't become legal obligation. The adult-child situation. More common than you might think, especially in your demographic. Are we talking about establishing clear boundaries, or are we dealing with entitlement issues that have escalated? Both, I think. 3 years of financial support that was supposed to be temporary, and now the recipient is making demands about how I should manage my own assets. Patricia's knowing chuckle told me she'd heard this story before. Let me guess, they've become comfortable with the arrangement and are now offering advice about how you should live your life to better serve their interests? That's remarkably accurate. Robert, the first thing you need to understand is that generosity without boundaries creates dependency, and dependency often breeds resentment on both sides. The person receiving support begins to feel entitled to it, while the person providing it begins to feel taken advantage of. She outlined a strategy that was both legally sound and personally liberating. Clear documentation of all financial support provided, formal notice of support termination, and legal protection against claims of implied obligation or verbal agreements. More importantly, she explained how to protect myself against manipulation tactics that often emerged when adult children face the reality of financial independence. They'll try emotional manipulation first, she warned. Accusations that you're abandoning them, that families should take care of each other, that you're being cruel or unreasonable. When that fails, they might attempt legal pressure, claiming you created an obligation through your support pattern. And if that doesn't work, then they'll usually try to negotiate partial support, promising to do better while asking for just enough help to maintain their current lifestyle. The key is understanding that none of these responses address the fundamental issue, which is their unwillingness to take responsibility for their own choices. By the time I finished the call with Patricia, I had a complete legal framework for what I was about to do. Everything properly documented, every boundary clearly established, every potential manipulation tactic anticipated and neutralized. I walked back into the house to find Marcus exactly where I'd left him, sitting in my office chair like a man who'd been sentenced but hadn't yet accepted the verdict. We need to finish our conversation, I said, settling into the chair across from my own desk. Dad, I've been thinking about what you said. Maybe I have been taking your support for granted. Maybe I need to be more grateful for everything you've done for me. Grateful. The word hung in the air like smoke from a fire that had already burned too long. 3 years of funding his lifestyle, and now he wanted to discuss gratitude as if it were a retroactive payment plan. Marcus, gratitude doesn't pay car insurance premiums. Gratitude doesn't cover rent or utilities or the 1,000 other expenses I've been absorbing while you developed your business plan. I know that. I'm saying maybe it's time I took more responsibility for my own expenses. Maybe it's time. Another phrase that meant everything and nothing simultaneously. Maybe suggested possibility rather than commitment. Time implied an indefinite future delay. And responsibility was something he'd been avoiding for 36 months. When would this increased responsibility begin? Well, I'd need some time to transition. Maybe we could work out a gradual reduction in support over the next few months while I ramp up my business development efforts. A gradual reduction. I'd heard similar proposals before, usually when the quarterly insurance bill came due or when his credit card balance approached its limit. Always gradual, always future-focused, always contingent on business development efforts that never materialized. Marcus, I said quietly, let me share something with you that might provide some clarity. I opened my laptop and pulled up a spreadsheet I'd been updating for months, a detailed analysis of every dollar I'd spent supporting his lifestyle compared to every dollar he'd contributed to his own maintenance. In the past 3 years, you've generated exactly $0 in business revenue. During that same period, I've provided $63,000 in direct financial support, plus housing, utilities, and various other expenses that bring the total closer to $90,000. The numbers glowed on the screen between us, undeniable mathematics that reduced 3 years of family dynamics to a simple equation. My investment versus his return? Now you're proposing a gradual transition that would allow you to continue accessing my resources while promising future responsibility that may or may not materialize based on business development efforts that have been unsuccessful for 36 consecutive months. Marcus stared at the spreadsheet like it was written in a language he didn't understand, which, in a sense, it was. The language of accountability was foreign to someone who'd been living consequence-free for 3 years. When you put it like that, it sounds worse than it really is. Does it? Because from where I'm sitting, it looks like a textbook case of financial dependency disguised as temporary assistance. I closed the laptop and leaned back in my chair, studying this man I'd raised and supported and enabled until he'd become someone I barely recognized. Here's what's going to happen, Marcus. The Maserati will be in storage by evening. The guest house lease will be terminated with appropriate notice. All financial support ends immediately. You have 30 days to make alternative arrangements for housing, transportation, and every other aspect of your lifestyle that I've been subsidizing. The color drained from his face as the full scope of his new reality became clear. This wasn't a negotiation or a gradual transition. This was a complete severing of the financial umbilical cord that had been sustaining him. Dad, you can't just throw me out on the street. I need time to find a job, get established, figure out where to live. You've had 3 years to figure those things out. How much more time do you need? But I don't have any money saved. I don't have anywhere to go. The admission hung between us like a confession of everything wrong with our arrangement. 3 years of me providing everything while he saved nothing, planned nothing, prepared for nothing beyond continued dependence on my generosity. Marcus, that's exactly the problem. You're 24 years old, college educated, physically capable, and completely unprepared for basic adult responsibilities because I've been enabling your avoidance of them. I'm not trying to avoid responsibility. I've been building a business. Building a business that generates no revenue while living rent-free in housing I provide, driving a car I purchased, eating food I pay for, and using utilities I cover. That's not building a business, son. That's playing house with someone else's money. The truth of it settled over both of us like dust after an explosion. 3 years of pretending his theoretical consulting business was a legitimate career path while I funded his lifestyle and convinced myself I was helping him succeed. Through the window, I could see the precision auto transport truck turning onto my street, arriving exactly on schedule to collect the Maserati that Marcus had been treating as his personal property. Your ride's here, I said, nodding toward the truck. Marcus rushed to the window, watching as two uniformed professionals began preparing to load his beautiful sports car onto the transport trailer. Dad, please, we can work this out. I'll get a job, I'll pay you back, I'll do whatever you want. Just don't take everything away at once. Everything I'm taking away belongs to me, Marcus. The car I purchased, the insurance I pay, the housing I own, the utilities I cover. I'm not taking your possessions. I'm reclaiming mine. The distinction was crucial, though I could see he didn't understand it yet. In his mind, 3 years of using my resources had somehow transformed them into his entitlements. The shock he was experiencing came from discovering that generosity and ownership were very different concepts. The transport driver knocked on my front door, clipboard in hand, and professional efficiency radiating from every gesture. Mr. Thompson, we're here for the 2022 Maserati Ghibli. Do you have the keys and registration documents? I handed him both, noting how Marcus watched the exchange like a man witnessing his own funeral. The keys he'd carried for 18 months, now transferred to a stranger who would drive his beautiful car up a ramp and away from his life. The car will be in secure storage at our Riverside facility, the driver explained. You can retrieve it anytime with proper identification and proof of insurance coverage. Thank you. I appreciate your promptness. As the Maserati disappeared down my street on the back of the transport truck, Marcus stood at the window, like a child watching his favorite toy being taken away by adults who didn't understand how much it meant to him. That car was everything to me, he said quietly. No, Marcus. That car was everything to you because you never had to earn it, maintain it, or take responsibility for it. When things are given to you without effort, they feel precious because you never learned their actual value. I walked back to my desk and pulled out a manila envelope I'd prepared that morning, documents that would formalize everything we'd discussed. These are copies of all the financial records showing exactly how much I've spent supporting you. Bank statements, credit card bills, insurance payments, utility records, everything documented and dated. Marcus took the envelope like it contained evidence of a crime he'd hoped no one would discover. Also included is formal notice that all financial support ends immediately, along with 30-day notice for the guest house. Everything legal, everything documented, everything final. Dad, this feels like you're punishing me for asking about the car. I'm not punishing you, son. I'm teaching you. There's a difference between consequences and punishment. Punishment is arbitrary penalty for wrongdoing. Consequences are the natural results of choices and actions. You chose to live off my generosity for 3 years while developing no independent income. You chose to make demands about my property while contributing nothing to the household that supports you. These are the natural consequences of those choices. Marcus sank into the chair across from my desk, the envelope of documents heavy in his hands like the weight of reality he'd been avoiding. What am I supposed to do now? What every other 24-year-old does when they need money. Get a job, any job. Then get a better job. Then maybe, eventually, start that consulting business you've been planning for 3 years, but with your own money and your own risk. But I don't have any experience. I don't have references. I don't have a work history. Marcus, you have a college degree and 3 years of time you could have been building exactly those things. Instead, you chose to live in a fantasy where business plans and LinkedIn profiles were substitutes for actual work. The doorbell rang, interrupting our conversation. Through the window, I could see a young woman in a Morrison property management uniform, carrying a folder and wearing the professional expression of someone who handled family housing transitions regularly. That would be Janet from the property management company, here to discuss the guest house situation and help you understand your timeline for alternative arrangements. Marcus looked at me with something that might have been hope. Dad, before you go through with this, can I ask you one question? Of course. If I got a job tomorrow, if I started paying my own expenses, if I proved I could be responsible, would you consider letting me stay in the guest house and work out some kind of payment plan for what I owe you? The question revealed everything about how little he understood the situation. He was still thinking in terms of negotiation, still believing that the right combination of promises and proposals could restore the comfortable arrangement he'd been exploiting. Marcus, I said gently, the question isn't whether you can become responsible enough to deserve my continued support. The question is whether I can trust that this crisis will motivate genuine change, rather than just better promises. I opened the door for Janet from Morrison Property Management, knowing that the next 30 minutes would transform my son's understanding of how quickly a comfortable life could become complicated when the person funding it decided enough was enough. But this was still just the beginning of what I'd planned, because Marcus was about to discover that losing a car and a house was nothing compared to what happened when someone who'd been patient for 3 years finally decided to stop being patient altogether. The real surprise was still coming. Janet Morrison stepped into my living room with the practiced efficiency of someone who'd handled countless family housing transitions. Her smile was professional but warm, the kind that acknowledged difficult circumstances without judgment. Mr. Thompson, I'm here to discuss the guest house situation we talked about earlier, she said, setting her folder on the coffee table. I have the standard forms for lease termination and can walk you through the timeline requirements. Marcus watched this interaction with growing desperation, finally understanding that multiple strangers were now involved in dismantling his comfortable existence. The woman from the property management company wasn't here for consultation. She was here for implementation. Given the family relationship, Janet continued, we can offer some flexibility in the standard 30-day notice period if both parties agree to expedited terms. Sometimes a shorter transition works better for everyone involved. I glanced at Marcus, who looked like a man watching his parachute fail to deploy. What would expedited terms look like? 14 days is our minimum for occupied residential properties. That provides adequate time for alternative housing arrangements while minimizing the financial impact on all parties. 14 days, 2 weeks for Marcus to find housing, employment, and transportation simultaneously. The timeline that had seemed impossibly rushed that morning now felt almost generous considering his complete lack of preparation for independence. That seems reasonable, I said, noting how Marcus's mouth fell open at my casual acceptance of his accelerated eviction. Janet pulled out a tablet and began typing. I'll need the current tenant's signature acknowledging receipt of formal notice. Mr. Marcus Thompson, correct? Marcus stared at the tablet like it was a death warrant. I haven't agreed to anything. This is my father's decision, not mine. Sir, the lease agreement is between your father and our company. As the property owner, he has the right to terminate tenancy with appropriate notice. Your agreement isn't required for the legal process. The finality of Janet's explanation hit Marcus harder than anything I'd said. Official procedures were in motion, handled by professionals who dealt with housing transitions as routine business rather than family drama. Dad, please, can we discuss this privately before making it official? I looked at my son, seeing genuine panic for the first time all day. The theoretical consequences we'd been discussing were becoming concrete reality, complete with paperwork and deadlines. Marcus, what would you like to discuss? I know I messed up this morning. I know asking for your car was wrong, but destroying my entire living situation seems like an extreme response to one conversation. Janet glanced between us, recognizing family dynamics that had probably escalated beyond normal tenant-landlord relationships. Mr. Thompson, would you prefer that I wait outside while you finish your discussion? No, that won't be necessary. My son needs to understand that this isn't about one conversation this morning. This is about 3 years of conversations that led us here. I turned back to Marcus, who was gripping the arms of his chair like a passenger in turbulence. Son, when someone lives rent-free for 3 years while making demands about their benefactor's lifestyle choices, that's not a single mistake. That's a pattern of entitlement that needs correction. But I never demanded anything before today. You demanded financial support every month when your accounts ran short. You demanded I cover your insurance when you couldn't afford payments. You demanded I maintain your lifestyle while you pursued business opportunities that generated no income. Janet continued typing, documenting our conversation for what I assumed were legal protection purposes. Family housing disputes probably required careful record-keeping. The difference is that this morning you made demands about my property instead of requests for my resources. That showed me exactly how you view our relationship and my role in your life. Marcus turned to Janet with desperate hope. Ma'am, isn't there some kind of mediation process? Some way to resolve family disputes without immediate eviction? Sir, we offer mediation services for landlord-tenant conflicts, but those typically address issues like rent disputes or property maintenance. This appears to be a family relationship matter that's evolved beyond standard rental situations. The professional distance in Janet's response made clear that Marcus's personal circumstances weren't her company's responsibility. Property management companies handled housing transitions, not family therapy. However, she continued, if both parties agree to modify terms, we can certainly document alternative arrangements. Mr. Thompson, would you be willing to consider a rent-paying situation instead of termination? I studied Marcus's face, seeing hope flicker in his eyes as Janet offered what sounded like a lifeline. The possibility that he could transform this crisis into simply becoming a paying tenant instead of facing complete displacement? That's an interesting option, I said carefully. Marcus, are you prepared to pay market rate rent for the guest house, plus all utilities, effective immediately? Market rate for that property would be approximately $1,800 monthly, Janet added, consulting her tablet. Plus utilities, we're looking at roughly $2,200 in total monthly expenses. $2,200. Marcus had never earned $2,200 in any single month during his 3-year residency. The number represented more income than his consulting business had generated in its entire theoretical existence. Dad, you know I don't have that kind of money right now, but if you gave me a few months to get established, I could work up to it. A few months to get established. The same timeline he'd been requesting for 36 consecutive months, always just a few months away from financial independence that never materialized. Marcus, what's changed about your situation that would make the next few months different from the past 36 months? The question hung between us while Janet continued typing, documenting another family's financial dysfunction for her company's records. I'd be more motivated knowing I had real deadlines and responsibilities. You mean the kind of motivation that comes from facing homelessness? I mean the kind of motivation that comes from having clear expectations and consequences. I almost smiled at the irony. My son was discovering that consequences were indeed motivating, just not in the comfortable, gradual way he'd hoped to experience them. Janet, what happens if a tenant agrees to market rate rent but fails to make payments? Standard eviction procedures would apply. Typically 5 days notice for non-payment. Then formal eviction proceedings if payment isn't received. 5 days. The timeline for rent default was even shorter than the 14 days we'd been discussing for voluntary termination. Marcus would be trading his current crisis for an even more precarious situation. So if Marcus agreed to pay $2,200 monthly rent starting next month and then couldn't make the payment, he'd have 5 days to come up with the money or face immediate eviction? That's correct. And eviction proceedings create legal records that can make future housing arrangements significantly more difficult. I watched Marcus process this information, seeing him realize that agreeing to pay rent he couldn't afford would actually worsen his situation rather than improve it. Maybe the 14-day termination option is more appropriate, I said quietly. It gives Marcus time to find housing he can actually afford, rather than setting him up for failure with obligations he can't meet. Marcus looked between Janet and me like a defendant watching a judge and jury decide his fate. The mathematical reality was undeniable. He couldn't afford to stay even if I allowed it. I understand, he said finally, his voice barely above a whisper. I'll sign whatever you need me to sign. Janet pulled out the formal termination notice, a document that would make Marcus's situation official and legally binding. This acknowledges your receipt of 14-day notice to vacate the premises. Your final day of occupancy will be December 15th. December 15th. 2 weeks from today, Marcus would need to have found alternative housing, secured transportation, and begun generating income to support himself. The timeline that had seemed impossible that morning now felt like the natural consequence of 3 years of poor decisions. He signed his name with shaking hands, each letter sealing his transition from dependent to independent adult. Janet provided copies of everything, explaining his rights as a tenant and resources available for people facing housing transitions. After Janet left, Marcus and I sat in silence for several minutes. The professional efficiency of the property management visit had transformed our family conflict into a legal matter, with deadlines and documentation. Dad, I need you to know that I understand why you're doing this. I looked at my son, searching for signs of genuine comprehension rather than manipulation disguised as acceptance. I've been taking advantage of your generosity for 3 years. I've been living like someone who earned this lifestyle instead of someone who was given it. And this morning, I crossed a line by making demands instead of expressing gratitude. The words sounded sincere, but I'd heard similar speeches before, usually when his quarterly insurance bill came due or when his credit card approached its limit. What are you going to do now, Marcus? I'm going to get a job, any job. Tomorrow morning, I'll start applying everywhere until someone hires me. Then I'll find a place I can afford and start building the kind of life I should have been building all along. And your consulting business? Maybe someday, but first I need to learn how to support myself with actual work that pays actual money. The consulting business was a fantasy I used to avoid facing reality. For the first time all day, Marcus sounded like an adult acknowledging adult responsibilities. The crisis that had begun with his car demand was forcing him to confront 3 years of avoidance and self-deception. I'm proud of you for saying that, son. Are you proud enough to maybe extend the timeline a little? Give me 30 days instead of 14? There it was, the negotiation attempt I'd been expecting, wrapped in apparent maturity and self-awareness. Marcus was learning to say the right words, but he was still trying to manipulate outcomes in his favor. Marcus, the timeline stands. 14 days gives you enough time to make necessary arrangements without giving you enough time to procrastinate or hope for rescue. But Dad, 2 weeks isn't enough time to find a job and an apartment and get everything sorted out. 2 weeks is plenty of time for someone who's genuinely motivated. You'll be amazed how quickly you can accomplish things when failure isn't an option. I stood up and walked to my desk, pulling out a business card I'd been saving for exactly this conversation. This is the employment agency I used when I was starting my financial planning practice 26 years ago. They specialize in placing people quickly, even those without extensive work history. Marcus took the card like it was a lifeline thrown to someone drowning in his own poor choices. They open at 8 tomorrow morning. I suggest you be there when they unlock the door. I will be, I promise. Promises. Another word that had lost meaning through overuse in our relationship. Marcus had promised to find work hundreds of times over the past 3 years, always with the same earnest sincerity he was displaying now. Son, I don't need your promises anymore. I need your actions. Show me you can support yourself for 6 months, and we can discuss rebuilding our relationship on more equal terms. 6 months? 6 months of steady employment, independent housing, and financial responsibility. No assistance from me, no emergency loans, no crisis interventions. Prove you can be an adult, and we can figure out what kind of relationship we want to have going forward. The timeline represented more than practical goals. It was a test of whether the man sitting across from me was capable of genuine change or merely skilled at temporary compliance when circumstances demanded it. And if I can't do it, if I fail, then you'll learn what failure actually costs when someone isn't there to absorb the consequences for you. The honesty of my answer seemed to hit Marcus harder than anything else I'd said. For 3 years, I'd been his safety net, catching him every time his poor choices led to falling. Now he was facing the possibility of hitting the ground for the first time in his adult life. I won't fail, Dad. I can't fail. Good. That's the kind of motivation that leads to actual results. I walked him to the door, noting how different he looked from the confident young man who'd arrived that morning demanding my car. The crisis had stripped away his casual entitlement, revealing someone who was finally beginning to understand the relationship between choices and consequences. Marcus, I want you to know that everything I'm doing comes from love, not anger. It doesn't feel like love right now. Real love sometimes requires allowing people to experience the natural results of their decisions. Protecting you from consequences wasn't helping you grow. It was keeping you dependent. He nodded, though I could see he didn't fully understand yet. Understanding would come over the next 2 weeks as he navigated job interviews, apartment searches, and budget calculations without my financial cushion beneath him. I'll call you in a few days to see how things are going. Actually, Marcus, I won't be available for progress reports or crisis management. You need to handle this completely independently. The finality of my statement registered on his face as another door closing, another safety net being removed. For 14 days, he would experience what true independence felt like, without the option of calling Dad when things got difficult. As I watched him walk toward the guest house to begin packing 3 years of accumulated possessions, I felt something I hadn't experienced in months. Relief mixed with hope that this crisis might finally motivate the changes I'd been hoping to see for years. The phone rang as I was cleaning up the paperwork from our morning's legal transactions. An unknown number, which I answered cautiously. Mr. Thompson, this is Mike from Precision Auto Transport. I wanted to confirm that your vehicle is secure in our facility and provide you with the retrieval procedures. Thank you, Mike. How does someone go about retrieving the car? They'll need valid identification, current insurance coverage, and payment for storage fees. Current rate is $50 per day. $50 per day. Marcus's beautiful Maserati was accumulating storage costs faster than he'd ever generated income. By the time he could afford insurance and storage fees, the car would represent a financial burden rather than a status symbol. How long do people typically leave vehicles in storage? Varies widely. Some folks retrieve them within a few days once they sort out insurance. Others realize they can't afford the ongoing costs and end up selling the vehicle to cover accumulated fees. The irony was perfect. Marcus's demand for my car that morning had resulted in his losing access to any car at all. The Maserati he'd treated as personal property was now costing him $50 daily to maintain, while generating zero value in return. Thank you for the information, Mike. No problem, Mr. Thompson. We'll take good care of the vehicle until someone can meet the retrieval requirements. After hanging up, I sat in my quiet house, surrounded by the evidence of a day that had changed everything between Marcus and me. The manila folder of bank statements that had started this conversation, the legal documents formalizing his eviction, the business card for the employment agency that might help him find his first real job. 3 years of enabling had ended with one morning's worth of consequences. Marcus was facing the reality that most 24-year-olds navigated successfully every day, the challenge of supporting himself through his own efforts rather than someone else's generosity. My phone buzzed with a text message from an unknown number. Dad, this is Marcus from Sarah's phone. I know you said no contact, but I wanted you to know I spent the afternoon applying for jobs and looking at apartments. I found a place I can afford if I get hired at the warehouse job I interviewed for today. Thank you for finally helping me grow up. I stared at the message for a long time before deleting it without response. Marcus was learning that independence meant handling challenges without seeking approval or support from the people who used to solve problems for him. Outside, the December evening was settling over my neighborhood, with the peaceful quiet of people living within their means and taking responsibility for their own choices. Mrs. Patterson's porch light came on as she prepared for another normal evening in a life built on decades of personal accountability. Tomorrow, Marcus would wake up in the guest house for one of his final mornings there, facing job applications and apartment searches with the urgency that only genuine consequences could provide. He would discover whether 3 years of business development had actually prepared him for the working world, or whether he'd been avoiding reality longer than either of us had admitted. The car swap he'd demanded that morning had taught him the difference between ownership and entitlement, between making requests and making demands, between being family and being a dependent. Most importantly, it had shown him that generosity wasn't unlimited, and that even patient people eventually reach their limits. As I turned off the lights and prepared for bed, I felt something I hadn't experienced since Maria died 8 years ago. Pride in a difficult decision made for the right reasons. Love expressed through boundaries rather than enablement. Hope that my son might finally become the man I'd always believed he could be, once he stopped depending on me to prevent him from failing. The morning would bring new challenges for both of us. Marcus would begin his first day as a truly independent adult, while I would start learning how to be a father who supported through expectations rather than excuses. The car situation had become about much more than transportation. It had become about the kind of people we chose to be when comfort was no longer guaranteed. For the first time in 3 years, I fell asleep knowing that both Marcus and I would wake up tomorrow with the opportunity to become better versions of ourselves. The difference was that now he would have to earn that opportunity instead of having it handed to him. The real education was just beginning.